My son said, "I sold your house to pay for a vacation for me and my wife. You have 1 day to pack your things." I just smiled. He didn't know that the house was already. Good day, dear listeners. It's Louisa again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way, I can see how far my story has traveled. I had lived in that house for 41 years. I want you to understand what that means. 41 years of the same creaky third step on the staircase, the same view of the maple tree from my kitchen window, the same smell of old wood and dried lavender that I kept in a ceramic bowl on the hallway shelf. My husband, Gerald, planted that maple the spring we moved in, back when Derek was only 3 years old and still small enough to carry on one arm. Gerald was gone now, 11 years gone, but the tree was still there, taller than the roofline, throwing shade across the front porch every summer afternoon. That house was not just property. It was everything that remained of the life Gerald and I had built together. I retired from teaching second grade at Millbrook Elementary after 32 years. The parents always said I had a gift for spotting when a child was struggling before the child even knew it themselves. I'd like to think that was true. I noticed things, small things. The way a child's handwriting changed when something was wrong at home. The way a smile didn't quite reach the eyes. I noticed things, and I remembered them. After Gerald died, Derek came around more often. In the beginning, I thought it was grief, his and mine, shared and tender. He would sit at my kitchen table and drink the coffee I made too strong, and we would talk about his father. Those were good years, or at least decent ones. Lonely, but manageable. I had my garden, my book club on Thursday evenings, my neighbor Ruth, who brought me tomatoes from her garden, and stayed for hours talking about nothing and everything. Then Derek married Brittany. I want to be fair. I tried to like her. She was attractive in the way of someone who worked very hard at it. Highlighted hair, careful makeup, clothes that cost more than my monthly grocery budget. She called me Eleanor from the first meeting, never Mom or even Mrs. Hart. And there was something in the way she said it that always felt like a small, precise boundary being drawn. Derek changed around her, not all at once. Gradually, the way water changes a riverbank. He laughed differently. He deferred to her in ways that made me uncomfortable. He stopped coming to Sunday dinners alone. Now they came together, or not at all. The first real warning sign came about 2 years ago. Derek asked me, very casually, over the phone, whether I had ever thought about downsizing. He used that word, downsizing, as if the house were a corporate asset being evaluated for efficiency. I told him I was perfectly comfortable where I was. He said, of course, he was just asking. But something in his voice made me set the phone down and sit for a long moment in the silence of my kitchen. After that, the questions became more frequent and less casual. Had I thought about assisted living? There were some lovely places, he said. Not that I needed that, of course, just planning ahead. Did I know what the property taxes were these days? Weren't they a burden? Had I updated my will recently? Each question came wrapped in concern, in the language of care, but underneath it I felt something else, something calculating and impatient. Brittany began making comments about the house itself. Such a big space for one person, she said once, standing in my living room, turning slowly as if she were already measuring it for new furniture. Gerald had such classic taste, she added, which was her way of saying the house was outdated. I smiled and offered her more tea. I started paying attention differently after that. I noticed that Derek had begun asking detailed questions about the deed, who held it, whether it was in both my and Gerald's name, whether it had been updated after Gerald's death. I told him the truth. The house was in my name alone, had been since Gerald's death, when we'd sorted everything with our attorney, Paul Hendricks, who had handled our affairs for 20 years. Derek nodded and didn't ask again, but he asked Brittany something in a low voice as they left, and she glanced back at the house before getting into the car in a way that settled cold in my stomach. The morning it happened was an ordinary Tuesday in late October. The maple had gone entirely gold overnight, and I was drinking my first cup of coffee on the porch, watching a squirrel argue with the bird feeder, when Derek's car pulled up. He was alone. He came up the porch steps quickly, not like someone coming for a visit, like someone with an appointment. He did not sit down. He stood in front of me and he said, "Mom, I sold the house. Britt and I have been planning a trip to Europe. We've been working really hard and we need this. I took care of everything. The closing is in 30 days. You have a day to figure out what you're taking with you." I looked up at him. The morning light was very clean and gold through the maple leaves, and I smiled. He shifted his weight, uncertain. He had expected tears, or argument, or collapse. He did not know, could not have known what I knew. He did not know what I had already done. But we will get to that. After Derek's car disappeared around the corner, I sat on that porch for a long time. The squirrel had given up on the bird feeder and gone. The street was quiet. A neighbor's dog barked twice somewhere down the block, and then that too fell silent. I held my coffee cup in both hands, even though it had gone cold, and I let myself feel what was underneath the smile I had given my son. The real thing, the thing I had hidden behind 40 years of practiced composure. I was afraid. I want to say that clearly because what comes later might make it seem as though I was always calm, always certain. I was not. I was a 72-year-old woman sitting alone on a porch in October, and my son had just told me he had sold my home. My hands were trembling slightly. I noticed that the way I used to notice things in the classroom, clinically, from a slight distance, the way you observe a fact you'd rather not accept. I went inside. I sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Derek had drunk my strong coffee and talked about his father, and I began to think. The first thing I needed to understand was what had actually happened. Derek said he had sold the house. But what did that mean legally? You cannot simply sell a property that does not belong to you. Had he forged my signature? Had he found some document I'd signed years ago without understanding? Had Paul Hendricks made an error when we transferred the deed? I did not know. And not knowing was the worst part. I thought about what I did know. 3 years ago, almost exactly 3 years, I had had a long conversation with Paul after a woman from my book club, Harriet, told us what had happened to her sister. Her sister's children had quietly manipulated her into signing a general power of attorney, and within 18 months, the sister's house had been sold, the money spent, and the sister placed in a facility she hadn't chosen. Harriet told that story with flat, dry precision, and the room had gone very quiet. I had gone to see Paul the following week. What I did 3 years ago, I couldn't tell Derek yet. I needed to confirm everything was still in place, that nothing had been tampered with, that my paperwork was as solid as I believed it to be. But even before I confirmed it, I knew this. I had not sat still. I had not trusted the future to take care of itself. I had acted when action was possible, quietly and without announcement, precisely because I had listened to Harriet's story and recognized its warning. That recognition was the thing that steadied me now. I got up from the table and walked to my desk in the small room off the hallway that Gerald had always called the study, though it was really just a room with bookshelves and the old roll-top desk his mother had left him. I opened the second drawer on the right side. Not the first, where I kept regular correspondence, but the second, which was deeper, and required a small key I kept on the same ring as my car key. Inside was a folder, and inside the folder were documents. I did not read them yet. I simply put my hand on them, felt the paper, and took a breath. Then I picked up the phone and called Paul Hendricks. He answered on the third ring, which was typical. Paul was methodical, never rushed. I told him what Derek had said. There was a pause on Paul's end, brief but significant. Then he asked me to come to his office the next morning, first thing, and to bring the folder. He said, "Eleanor, before you worry too much, tell me again exactly what Derek said. His exact words." I repeated them. Another pause. Then, "All right. Come at 9. Bring everything." I said I would. I hung up the phone and stood in the study for a moment. The fear was still there. But it had a shape now, and things with a shape can be dealt with. I had spent 32 years teaching children that confusion was not the enemy, that the enemy was giving up before you understood the problem. I was not going to give up. I made a list. This is what I always did when I was overwhelmed. I made lists in my careful, square handwriting with a good pen. The list had 2 columns. One column said, what Derek might have done. The other said, what I have already done. The first column was frightening. He might have forged a signature on a quitclaim deed. He might have found a notary willing to certify something false. He might have contacted a real estate agent and entered into a purchase agreement, which, depending on what documentation he provided, might have already created legal complications that would take months and money to unravel. The second column was shorter, but it was the column that mattered. 3 years ago, following my conversation with Paul, I had transferred the property into a revocable living trust, the Eleanor M. Hart Living Trust. The trust was the legal owner of the house. I was the trustee and the sole beneficiary. The property could not be sold, transferred, or encumbered without my signature as trustee, with proper documentation, through proper legal channels. No power of attorney, however broadly worded, gave Derek authority over the trust. I had specifically asked Paul about this. He had confirmed it clearly, in writing. Derek did not know about the trust. I had never told him. This was deliberate. Not because I distrusted him then, not entirely, but because Paul had advised me that the trust's protective value was partly in its privacy. You don't need to announce your legal arrangements to anyone, Paul had said. The trust does its job whether people know about it or not. So now the question was not whether I was protected. I believed I was. The question was what Derek had actually done, what papers he had signed, what buyers he had misled, what lies he had already told in my name. Because if he had forged documents, that was not a family dispute. That was a crime. I sat with that word for a moment. Crime. My son. I looked at the maple tree through the study window, the tree Gerald had planted when Derek was 3 years old. Then I picked up my pen and added one more item to my list. Call Paul. Bring everything. Find out exactly what Derek has done. I underlined it twice and went to make a fresh pot of coffee. I was going to need it. Paul Hendricks had been practicing law in the same office on Clement Street for 34 years. The office smelled of old carpeting and printer ink and the particular staleness of rooms where serious matters are regularly discussed. His receptionist, a quiet woman named Gail, who had worked for him nearly as long as I had known him, took my coat and offered me coffee without being asked. I sat across from Paul's broad oak desk, the folder on my lap, and told him everything Derek had said, in the order he had said it. Paul listened without interrupting. This was one of the things I respected most about him. He listened the way good doctors listen, with his full attention and without visible reaction. When I finished, he asked me to slide the folder across the desk. He spent several minutes reading through the documents. I looked out the window at Clement Street, a dry, pale November morning, the trees stripped bare, a city bus going past. I thought about Derek driving to this same street 30 years ago to argue over a parking ticket, how I had sat in Paul's waiting room then too, embarrassed and exasperated. How long ago that seemed. Eleanor, Paul said. He set the documents down carefully, aligned the edges. The trust is intact and correct. The property is held by the Eleanor M. Hart Living Trust. You are sole trustee, and there is no mechanism by which Derek, or anyone else, could legally convey this property without your signature in your capacity as trustee before a licensed notary with proper identification. Then what did he sell? I said. That, Paul said, is what we need to establish. He turned to his computer and began typing. You mentioned Derek asked you about the power of attorney 2 years ago. Did you ever sign one? Even years back, for something unrelated? I thought carefully. Yes. When Gerald was ill, very ill, in the last months, I signed a durable power of attorney for Derek, so he could handle things if I was incapacitated. Gerald's medical situation required Gerald to have one for me as well. It was standard. Did you revoke it after Gerald died? I opened my mouth, then I closed it. I had not revoked it. The document had receded into the background of the terrible machinery of grief, and then years had passed, and it had simply never come back into focus. I remembered Paul mentioning it. Had he sent a letter? I wasn't certain. The years after Gerald's death were genuinely blurred in places. Paul's expression remained steady, professional. I believe I sent you a recommendation to revoke it in 2016. It's possible it didn't register at the time. He paused. The power of attorney, if it wasn't revoked, is still technically on record. However, and this is critical, a power of attorney over your personal affairs does not extend to assets held in trust. The trust owns the house. You, as trustee, own the trust. The POA governs Eleanor Hart, the individual, not Eleanor Hart, the trustee. They are legally distinct roles. So he can't do it, I said. He cannot lawfully sell the property, Paul said carefully. But here is the complication. If Derek presented that POA to a real estate agent and perhaps a title company as authority to act on your behalf, and if those parties failed to conduct proper due diligence, which does happen, there may exist a purchase agreement, possibly even an earnest money deposit in your name. That doesn't transfer ownership, but it creates a mess that someone will have to clean up. And depending on how far Derek took this, it could constitute fraud. He said that last word simply, without drama, fraud. What do I do? I asked. We send a certified letter today to any title company or agent Derek may have engaged, notifying them that you are the sole trustee of the property, that no authorized sale was executed, and that any agreement purporting to convey this property is null and void. We also, he added, file a formal notation on the title record making the trust's ownership explicit and flagged, so that any future search will surface it immediately. He looked at me. And Eleanor, you may want to consider whether you wish to pursue this as a legal matter beyond the property dispute. I understood what he meant. I nodded. Let me make some calls this afternoon, Paul said. I suspect we'll know by end of day what Derek actually put in writing. By 4 o'clock that same afternoon, Paul called me at home. A real estate agent named Kevin Schaefer, affiliated with a small brokerage on the East Side, had entered into a listing agreement with someone presenting himself as Derek Hart, acting under power of attorney for Eleanor Hart. The listing had gone live on MLS 2 weeks prior. An offer had been accepted. Earnest money, $12,000, had been deposited by the buyers. Closing was scheduled for 32 days from now. The buyers were a young couple from Columbus. They were innocent in this. They knew nothing. Paul had already sent the notification letters. He had spoken with the title company, which had immediately put the closing on hold pending verification. The title officer, he said, was not pleased. which was Paul's way of saying the title officer was furious because a botched closing of this kind was expensive and embarrassing for everyone involved. I sat with the phone against my ear and listened to all of this and felt something settle inside me. Not relief exactly, but the specific clarity that comes when you finally understand the full shape of a problem. This was not ambiguous. This was not a misunderstanding. Derek had taken an old document, used it as a weapon, and tried to remove me from my home to fund a vacation. I asked Paul to send me copies of everything. He said he would. That evening, I made a different kind of list. Meanwhile, across town, in the apartment Derek and Brittany rented in the newer development near the highway, something was shifting. I didn't know this until much later, when Derek told me, during one of the uglier conversations that came later, that it was the title company's call that first cracked the plan. The title officer had called the number on file for the seller's representative and asked a series of routine verification questions that Derek could not fully answer. He had hung up and told Brittany something was wrong. She figured it out, Brittany had said, according to Derek, meaning me. Derek had told her that was impossible, that I was just a retired schoolteacher, that I wouldn't even know where to begin. But Brittany, to her credit, had looked at him and said, "She smiled, Derek." "You told me she smiled. That means she already knew something." He had dismissed her. He shouldn't have. The Franklin County Sheriff's Office had a financial crimes unit on the second floor of a building that smelled of industrial cleaning solution and burnt coffee. Detective Sandra Rowe was a compact woman in her late 40s with short, gray-streaked hair and the manner of someone who had heard many difficult stories and found them neither shocking nor boring, simply data requiring organization. She shook my hand firmly and gestured to the chair across from her desk. I had brought the folder, the trust documents, the copy of the original power of attorney, the MLS listing Paul had printed for me, the title company correspondence, and a written timeline I had prepared the night before in my square handwriting, with dates and direct quotes where I could remember them. Teaching for 32 years had given me one irreplaceable skill. I knew how to organize information for someone who had no prior context. Detective Rowe read my timeline without speaking. Then she looked up. "Mrs. Hart," she said, "are you prepared to file a formal complaint against your son?" I had asked myself that question approximately 40 times in the preceding 24 hours. Each time, the answer had been the same. "Yes," I said. She nodded, without approval or disapproval, simply acknowledging the answer. "I want to be honest with you about the process. This will take time. The DA's office will review the evidence before deciding whether to charge. Your son will likely be notified and given the opportunity to provide his account. If you have other family members, other children, relatives who might complicate the— Derek is my only child," I said, "and I have no illusions about what this is. He used a legal document I signed in good faith during my husband's illness to attempt to defraud a young couple and remove me from my home. I'm not here because I'm angry, Detective. I'm here because what he did was wrong, and because there are innocent buyers who deserve to have this resolved correctly." She looked at me for a moment. Then she opened a form on her computer and began to type. The formal complaint was filed that Thursday afternoon. Paul had already separately notified the State Bar's title fraud reporting mechanism and the Real Estate Licensing Board. The agent, Kevin Schaefer, would face his own inquiry into whether he'd performed adequate due diligence before accepting a POA-based listing without verifying trust ownership. I drove home in the early evening light, feeling emptied out in a way that wasn't entirely unpleasant, the way you feel after finally carrying something heavy to its proper place. The call came on Saturday morning. I was in the garden, cutting back the last of the season's growth. A ritual I had performed every November for decades, the garden going dormant and tidy under my hands. My phone rang. Derek. I let it ring 4 times and then answered. He did not begin with hello. He said, "What did you do?" "I'm not sure what you mean," I said, which was not quite honest, but then neither had he been. "The title company called me. They're saying the sale is void. They're saying there's some trust I apparently didn't know about." His voice had a shredded quality, tight with rage but fraying at the edges. "Mom, what is going on?" "Derek," I said, "I think you should come and talk to me in person, but I'd ask you not to come today. Give me until Monday." He hung up without responding. He did not wait until Monday. That afternoon, both he and Brittany arrived at the house. She had never before come without being invited, and they came up the porch steps quickly, together, which was when I knew this was intended as a confrontation rather than a conversation. I opened the front door before they could knock. I stood in the doorway, and I did not step aside. Brittany began. She had clearly rehearsed. Her voice was controlled, calibrated for maximum pressure, dressed as concern. "Eleanor, we're really worried about you. This past year, some of the things you've said, the decisions you've made, Derek and I have talked to a doctor about this, and we think it might be time to have a proper evaluation. For your own safety." There it was. The word they had selected, evaluation. I had expected something like this. Not exactly this, but something in this direction. This was the threat under the threat. If I moved legally against Derek, they would attempt to have me declared incompetent. It would not succeed. I had a doctor, a therapist, and a lawyer who would all testify clearly to my full competence. But it would be ugly and expensive and exhausting. I looked at Brittany and then at Derek, and I said very quietly, "Derek, I filed a complaint with the Franklin County Sheriff's Financial Crimes Unit on Thursday. The detective's name is Sandra Rowe. My attorney, Paul Hendricks, has also notified the Real Estate Licensing Board and the Title Fraud Reporting Division. This is now a matter of public record." The color left Derek's face in a way I had not seen since he was a small child and had done something he knew was genuinely wrong. "Furthermore," I continued, "I have scheduled an appointment next week with my physician, Dr. Anita Patel, who has been my doctor for 11 years, for a voluntary cognitive assessment. Not because I have any concern about my capacities, but because I anticipated you might raise this question, and I prefer to have the documentation." I paused. "If you make a formal claim that I am incompetent, you will need to retain an attorney, file in probate court, and present medical evidence. Dr. Patel will testify on my behalf. Paul Hendricks will represent the trust. You will lose, and the attempt will become part of the public record of this dispute." Brittany's expression shifted. The careful concern collapsed into something harder and more honest. "You can't do this to your own son," Derek said. His voice was different now, younger somehow. Not the voice of a man who had planned a real estate fraud. Something else. "You tried to sell my home," I said. "I live here. Your father planted that tree." I did not point at the maple. I didn't need to. "Go home, Derek. Talk to a lawyer. A real one who represents your interests, not mine. You're going to need one." They left. I went inside, locked the door, and sat down at the kitchen table. My hands were not trembling this time, but I was very tired. The deep kind of tired that has nothing to do with sleep. I called Ruth and asked if she might come over for dinner. She said yes immediately, without asking any questions, which was exactly what I needed. The following week, I did very little. I gardened. I read. I went to book club on Thursday and said nothing about any of it. I let Paul handle the correspondence. I took long walks in the cold November air and thought about Gerald and the maple tree and the 32 years I had taught second grade and all the children whose faces I could still see clearly. I was not finished, but I needed those days. They were necessary. The offer came through Paul, which told me something important. Derek had finally done what I told him to do and retained an attorney. The attorney's name was Mitchell Carey, and Paul described him to me as competent but optimistic, which I understood to mean that Carey had agreed to take Derek's money while privately assessing the situation as unfavorable to his client. The offer was direct. Derek and Brittany would return the $12,000 in earnest money, which, as Paul explained, they had already spent, which meant they would have to borrow it from somewhere, plus an additional $15,000 in what the letter called goodwill compensation, in exchange for my withdrawal of the complaint filed with the Franklin County Sheriff's Office and my agreement not to pursue civil remedies. $27,000 for my home, for 41 years, for what they had tried to do. I read the letter at Paul's desk and set it down carefully. "Paul," I said, "can they actually compel me to withdraw a criminal complaint once it's been filed?" "No," he said. "Once a complaint is in the hands of law enforcement, it proceeds at the discretion of the detective and the DA's office. You can state that you no longer wish to cooperate as a witness, which would complicate prosecution, but the complaint itself belongs to the state." "Then their offer is based on a misunderstanding of how this works," I said. "Largely, yes. Please send Mr. Carey a polite letter explaining that I decline," I said, "and that I will continue to cooperate fully with Detective Rowe." Paul smiled slightly, just at the corners. He wrote the letter while I sat there. That evening I called Ruth. I had known Ruth Calloway for 26 years. She had been my neighbor since the Brennan family sold the house next door, and in 26 years we had seen each other through a great deal. The deaths of spouses, the complications of adult children, the particular loneliness of being older in a world that moved too fast. Ruth was 70, sharp as a tack, and possessed of a quality I had always admired. She was never surprised by human nature, but she was never cynical about it either. She expected people to be difficult and still believed they could be better. I told her everything that evening, sitting at my kitchen table with the November dark pressing at the windows. I told her about Derek's announcement on the porch, about Paul, about Detective Rowe, about the competency threat and the offer. Ruth listened. She refilled our tea without being asked, which was something Gerald used to do. "Eleanor," she said when I'd finished, "how long have you been carrying this alone?" "About 3 weeks," I said. She shook her head. "Not in judgment, in the particular sorrow of someone who knows you too well. You always do that. You carry everything until it's sorted, and then you tell people." "I didn't want to worry anyone," I said, which was true, and also not the whole truth. The whole truth was that there is something in asking for help that has always been difficult for me, something that feels like admitting a weakness I shouldn't have. "You're not weak because your son did a terrible thing," Ruth said, which told me she had heard the part I didn't say. We sat together until nearly 10 o'clock. At some point, she called her son to say she'd be late, and he apparently asked no questions, which suggested she had raised him well. The next day, I called Caroline Jeffers. Caroline was the daughter of my old colleague Margaret Jeffers, who had taught 5th grade at Millbrook for 20 years before her retirement and subsequent death from a stroke 4 years ago. Caroline was a family law attorney in Columbus, not the type of attorney I needed for the criminal matter, but someone I trusted, who understood family dynamics and their legal ramifications, and who could tell me plainly what to expect in the coming months. We talked for an hour. Caroline confirmed what Paul had told me about the competency claim, that Derek would face a very high evidentiary standard, that his own conduct in this matter would be examined by any probate court, and that the attempt was more likely to harm him than me. She also told me something Paul had not said, or perhaps had not said directly enough. "Eleanor, what Derek did has a name. Using a power of attorney to attempt the transfer of an asset you're not authorized to transfer, even if the attempt failed, meets the definition of fraud. The DA will look at this seriously. You should be prepared for a process that takes 6 to 12 months. And you should be prepared for Derek to say things about you during that process that will be painful. I know, I said. Are you all right? She asked. Not professionally, as Margaret Jeffers's daughter, asking her mother's old colleague a human question. I'm getting there, I said. And I meant it. Slowly, in the way things actually get better. Not all at once, not dramatically. I was getting there. I had Ruth. I had Paul. I had Caroline, at the end of a phone line, ready to answer questions. I had Detective Rowe, who had called the previous week with a brief update. The investigation was proceeding. They were reviewing the documents. I should expect to hear more within the month. I was not alone. That was the thing I had needed to confirm, not through drama, not through a declaration, but through the slow, ordinary accumulation of people who showed up. I made soup that evening. From scratch, the way Gerald liked it. His mother's recipe, which I had written in my handwriting in the back of my recipe box because his mother's handwriting was impossible to read. I stood at the stove and stirred and listened to the November wind in the maple tree outside, and I thought, I am not going anywhere. They came on a Sunday afternoon 2 weeks later. I saw Derek's car from the kitchen window. It was a gray December Sunday, the street quiet, a dusting of old snow at the curb. He parked carefully, which was unusual. Derek typically pulled in fast. I watched from the window as both doors opened, as he and Brittany came up the front walk. He was carrying something. It took me a moment to identify it. Flowers. A paper-wrapped bunch of something orange and yellow. Chrysanthemums, I thought, though from the window I couldn't be certain. I stood at the kitchen counter and decided deliberately to let them knock. They knocked. I counted to 10. Not out of cruelty, but because I needed those 10 seconds to locate myself clearly, to know who I was when I opened the door. Then I opened it. Derek looked as I had rarely seen him, diminished somehow. The bluster of the October confrontation was gone. He was wearing his good coat, the charcoal one he wore to church on the rare occasions he went, and he held the flowers forward in both hands like something between an offering and a shield. "Mom," he said, "can we come in?" I stepped back from the doorway. They sat at the kitchen table. I put the flowers in water without comment and made coffee, because I am a Midwestern woman of 72, and I will make coffee in a crisis the way other people reach for a weapon. I set 3 cups on the table and sat across from them. Derek did the talking at first. He had clearly prepared, and what he said was structured and deliberate, which told me Mitchell Carey had probably advised him on what to say and what not to say. He said he had made a terrible mistake. He said he had been under financial pressure that he hadn't shared with me. He said that the European trip was not as extravagant as it seemed, that Brittany had been going through a difficult time, that the doctor had recommended a change of scene, that he had panicked and acted without thinking. Then, here it was, the thing Caroline Jeffers had predicted. He said, "Britt encouraged me. I'm not blaming her. But I wasn't thinking straight." Brittany, to her credit, did not flinch. She was better at stillness than Derek. I wrapped both hands around my coffee cup and looked at my son. I thought about the small boy who had run in from the backyard with a scraped knee, who had stood on this same kitchen floor while I cleaned the gravel from the wound and told him to be brave. I thought about that, and I set it aside, cleanly, because sentiment is useful, but it cannot be allowed to govern. "Derek," I said, "I appreciate that you came. I want to hear what you have to say. But I need you to understand something. What you did is in the hands of the sheriff's office now. It's not something I can undo, and I wouldn't undo it if I could." His jaw tightened. Brittany's hands moved. She folded them on the table, a composed gesture that had a great deal of effort in it. "You could speak to the detective," Derek said. "Tell her it was a misunderstanding, that you've resolved it as a family." "It was not a misunderstanding," I said. A pause. Then Brittany shifted. I saw it. A slight change in the set of her shoulders, a calculation made and decided upon. The careful, concerned Brittany receded, and something more direct took her place. "Eleanor," she said, "you're going to ruin his life, his career. You understand that? A fraud charge, even if it goes nowhere, that follows a person. Is that what you want for your son?" "I want my son to understand that actions have consequences," I said. "Oh, that's lovely," she said, and the warmth was entirely gone from her voice. "That's very philosophical. Your son, who has visited you every month for years, who has driven you to doctor's appointments." "Once," I said. "He drove me to one appointment, after Gerald died. I've driven myself ever since." She kept going, as if I hadn't spoken. "Who has worried about you living alone in this big house? Who tried to arrange something that would work for everyone?" "He tried to sell my home," I said, "without my knowledge or consent, to pay for a vacation." "It wasn't just a vacation," she said sharply, and Derek put his hand on her arm, which she ignored. "We are drowning. We are $30,000 in credit card debt. Derek hasn't had a raise in 3 years. I have medical bills. We are not doing this for fun, Eleanor. We are surviving." The silence after that was different from the other silences. It had weight. I felt something then. Not softening, not receding, but something more complex. A recognition that their difficulties might be real, and a simultaneous, clear-eyed understanding that real difficulties do not justify fraud. That sympathy and accountability are not opposites. That I could feel one without abandoning the other. "Brittany," I said, "I am sorry you're struggling. I mean that. But what Derek did was not a solution to your struggle. It was a crime committed against me, and against an innocent young couple who put $12,000 down on a house they cannot legally purchase." She stood up. The chair scraped. Her face had gone past controlled into something raw. "You are a vindictive, lonely old woman," she said, "and you are burning down your family because you can't stand that Derek has a life that doesn't revolve around you." Derek said her name. She was already walking to the door. He looked at me for a moment, a long, complicated look that I could not fully interpret, and then he followed her. I sat at the kitchen table after the door closed and listened to the car start and pull away. Then I got up and poured my coffee down the sink because it had gone cold. Brittany's last words sat in me like something with a weight and an edge. I will not pretend they didn't. I am not beyond being hurt by the suggestion that grief and solitude are the same thing as bitterness, that protecting my home was the same as punishing my son for having a life. But the hurt did something unexpected. It clarified. It sharpened the outline of everything I had already decided into something harder and more certain. Because I knew in the way you know things that are simply true, that what I had done was right, and I was going to see it through. The meeting was Paul's idea, and he organized it with the quiet efficiency that had made me trust him for 20 years. He called it a structured disclosure session, which was his way of making something stark sound procedural. The date was set for the 3rd week of December. Paul's conference room, 9 in the morning. Derek arrived with Mitchell Carey. I arrived with Paul. What Derek did not know, what Carey had apparently not been told, was that Detective Rowe would be present. Paul had coordinated with her office. She was not there in any formal arresting capacity. She was there because she had requested the opportunity to speak with Derek directly, and because Paul had determined that her presence would serve the interests of clarity. She sat at the end of the conference table in plain clothes with a notepad in front of her, and when Derek walked in and saw her, he stopped moving for just a moment. Carey recognized her immediately. He said something quiet and urgent to Derek, who seemed to need a moment to remember how to walk again. They sat down. We sat down. Detective Rowe introduced herself for the record and explained that her presence was voluntary, that this was not a formal interrogation, and that anything said in this room could be relevant to the ongoing investigation. Carrie noted his objection. Rowe acknowledged it without concern. Paul began. He laid out the documents in the order he had arranged them: the trust instrument, the original power of attorney, the MLS listing, the purchase agreement, the title company correspondence, and this was the piece I had not yet seen until Paul showed me the previous day: a notarized signature on the listing agreement in which Derek had signed my name. My name? In my name, in handwriting that was not mine. Paul placed the listing agreement and a sample of my actual signature from the trust documents side by side on the table and let the room look at both. "Mr. Hart?" Paul said, addressing Derek with a formality that was its own kind of statement. "This listing agreement presents your signature alongside a representation that you are acting under power of attorney for Eleanor Hart. The signature of Eleanor Hart on this document does not match Mrs. Hart's verified signature on any notarized instrument. Can you explain how this signature was produced?" Carrie said. "My client will not be answering questions about the specific documents at this time." But Derek had already opened his mouth. He said, "I didn't. The agent filled in the—" Carrie put a hand on his arm. Derek stopped. Detective Rowe wrote something on her notepad. The room was very quiet. Outside, through the window, I could see the December sky, flat white, the color of paper. It had the feeling of a held breath. Paul continued. He was methodical, thorough, and entirely without malice. He simply laid out each piece of evidence in sequence, like a teacher presenting a lesson plan. The timeline, the title company's hold notification, the complaints filed with the licensing board, the earnest money spent. At some point, Carrie requested a brief recess. He and Derek spoke in the hallway. I sat at the conference table with Paul and Detective Rowe and looked at the maple leaf pattern on the conference table's surface. Someone had chosen a nature motif for the veneer, which seemed appropriate. And I thought about nothing in particular. I was calm in a way that had nothing to do with the absence of emotion. It was more like what I imagined the eye of a storm must feel. Complete stillness that exists because of, not despite, everything around it. They came back in. Carrie made a statement. His client acknowledged that the process had been improperly conducted and wished to express regret for any confusion or harm caused to the buyers. He did not use the word fraud. He did not offer an explanation for the signature. Detective Rowe asked one question. "Mr. Hart, did you sign Eleanor Hart's name to any document without her knowledge or authorization?" Carrie began to instruct Derek not to answer. Derek, whose face had been the color of old paste for the past 40 minutes, suddenly said, "I thought—" "The POA said—" "Derek," Carrie said. "I thought it covered the house," Derek said. "I didn't know about the trust. I didn't know." More notes on the detective's pad. She clicked her pen once, deliberately. "Thank you," she said. He had just admitted to signing a document under a power of attorney he believed, incorrectly and without verification, authorized him to act. Whether this constituted fraud or a lesser offense would be for the DA's office to determine. But the admission was on the record. I had not said a word in the last 40 minutes. I had not needed to. I had simply sat at the table with my hands folded and let the evidence speak, which is something I had tried to teach my second graders, that the truth properly presented does not need to shout. At the end of the meeting, as everyone was collecting their papers, Derek looked at me. Just looked. His face was not angry anymore, or calculating, or the careful mask of the Sunday visit. It was the face of someone who had been found out completely and who knew it, and who was beginning to understand the full shape of what that meant. "Mom," he said. "Derek," I said, "I hope you get a good lawyer. I mean that." The Franklin County District Attorney's Office filed charges in February. Paul called me on a Tuesday morning in the second week of that month, when the yard was still deep in winter and the maple stood bare and patient against a pale sky. He told me in the same measured tone he used for all serious things. The DA had reviewed the investigation file and determined sufficient grounds. Derek Hart was charged with 1 count of forgery in the second degree and 1 count of attempted theft by deception. The forgery charge related to the signature on the listing agreement. The theft charge related to the attempt to convey property, the house, valued at $340,000, through unauthorized means. I sat down when Paul told me this. Not because I was shocked, I had known this was coming. I sat because standing suddenly required more effort than I could easily justify. "What happens now?" I said. "Derek's attorney will be offered the opportunity to negotiate a plea," Paul said. "Given that the attempted sale didn't complete and that Derek has no prior record and that he made statements in the meeting that show lack of specific criminal intent, a good attorney will argue he didn't understand the legal limitations of the POA. The likely outcome is a plea to a reduced charge with a suspended sentence, probation, fines, and community service." "He won't go to prison," I said. "Almost certainly not," Paul said. "I think you should prepare yourself for that outcome, Eleanor, because if you've been hoping—" "I haven't been hoping for that," I said. "I never wanted Derek in prison. I wanted it on record. I wanted it to be real. I wanted there to be a consequence that couldn't be minimized or talked around or blamed on me." Paul was quiet for a moment. "Then you're likely to get what you wanted," he said. The plea agreement was reached in late March. Derek pleaded guilty to a reduced charge: misuse of a power of attorney, a 4th-degree felony in Ohio, which carried no mandatory prison sentence for first-time offenders. He received 2 years of supervised probation, a fine of $8,000. Money he did not have, which meant a payment plan that would follow him for years, and 120 hours of community service. The conviction became part of his public record. His name was entered into the county court system, searchable by anyone who cared to look. Mitchell Carey had done his job. It was, as outcomes go, lenient. I understood that. But I also understood what Paul had said. It was real, and it was permanent, and it could not be erased. The buyers from Columbus, a young woman named Paige and her husband Marcus, had been in a terrible position for months through no fault of their own. Paul had been in contact with their attorney throughout. Their earnest money was ultimately returned by Derek's attorney, sourced from a personal loan Derek had taken against his car. They had found another property in January, a house in Westerville, smaller but solid, with a yard, and closed on it without incident. Paige sent me a handwritten note, which Paul forwarded. It said, "We were told what you did to protect us, and we want you to know we are grateful. We hope your home stays yours for as long as you want it." I kept that note in the folder with the trust documents. Kevin Schaefer, the real estate agent, lost his license. The Ohio Division of Real Estate found that he had failed to conduct adequate due diligence in verifying the scope of the power of attorney before accepting a listing, and that he had not confirmed the ownership status of the property through proper title search prior to executing the listing agreement. The finding was made public. He would not be reliquenced for a minimum of 3 years. The title company settled a separate professional liability matter. That was not my concern. I was simply informed of it by Paul, who tracked these things with the thoroughness of a man who had spent decades watching situations like this unravel. And the house, my house, the Eleanor M. Hart Living Trust's property, with the 41-year-old maple in the front yard, remained exactly where it had always been. Paul filed the updated title notation, which now made the trust ownership immediately visible to any future title search. He also filed the formal revocation of the power of attorney, which should have been done 11 years ago after Gerald's death, and which I signed in Paul's office on a bright March afternoon with the particular feeling of closing a door that should never have been left ajar. I drove home along Clement Street and then along the avenue, and then down my own block. I pulled into my driveway. I sat in the car for a moment and looked at the house. At the porch where Derek had stood on that October morning, at the maple tree with its first faint suggestion of new growth at the tips of the branches, at the window of the study where Gerald's mother's desk still stood. This was mine. It had always been mine. And now it was protected in every direction by law and documentation and the public record of what had happened when someone tried to take it. I got out of the car and went inside. By the following autumn, the maple had gone gold again. I stood at the kitchen window with my morning coffee and watched the light move through the leaves the way it always did at that hour. I had watched this every October of my adult life. I intended to watch it for whatever Octobers remained to me. The house looked different. In the spring, I had repainted the porch, a soft gray-green that Ruth had helped me choose. I had replaced the gutters and had Paul update my estate documents. The house was armored now, legally and physically, in ways it had not been before. My Thursday book club had welcomed 2 new members. In January, I had returned to Millbrook Elementary. Not to my old classroom, but to the reading support program for struggling second graders, 2 mornings a week. I had forgotten how much I loved this work. Coming back felt like returning to a room you'd left unlocked. In April, I flew to Oregon to visit my college roommate Barbara, and we spent 5 days walking on rocky beaches and talking until midnight, the way women who have known each other 50 years can talk, without preamble, without performance. I came home rested in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. As for Derek and Brittany filed for divorce in May. The legal proceedings had surfaced the full picture. $40,000 in credit card debt, an undisclosed home equity loan, the spent earnest money. She had not known all of it. I felt no satisfaction in this. Consequences rarely fall only where they are aimed. Derek was on probation, paying his fine in installments, completing community service at a food bank on Saturday mornings. He had lost his job and found a lesser one. I had not spoken to him since December. Whether I would, that question sat at the edge of my thinking, patient and unresolved. What I knew was this: the maple was gold, the coffee was hot, and the house was mine. If this story taught me anything, it's this: protecting yourself is not the same as being unloving. Quiet preparation is not paranoia. It is wisdom. I did not win because I was angry. I won because 3 years before that October morning, I sat in a lawyer's office and made a decision while everything was still calm. Love your family, but know your documents, know your rights, and if something feels wrong, it probably is. What would you have done in my place? If this story stayed with you, leave a comment below. I read everyone. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, please subscribe. Thank you so much for listening.